This is proof right here, guys. If you're watching this, you will not meet nicer people. Whoop, I'm going to point up there and there. You will not meet nicer people.
Coming back to a show that I dearly love and admire. So thanks for having me.
It's like, that's Big Starklighter's homie. So how did you know? Because I'm a nerd.
I've placed information vital to the survival of the rebellion into the memory systems of this R2 unit.
But, I was doing my research, and Wedge was obviously a character that you had to use if you were going to do Rogue Squadrons.
What are you doing, C-3PO? I'm taking one last look at my friends. These aren't your friends.
Cassie and Jim on the beach, and people are like, no. I can literally hear people that go, no.
It doesn't look like they're even hungry when they get out. They're not just like, did you bring a Snickers or something? There's no logic to it. And then later, when we haven't even talked about the Wilford Brimley of it all.
I'm honored to be here. I'm also impressed that you got Zach Galifianakis as a guest tonight.
Because Darth Vader was the scariest thing that had ever happened to anybody, and this guy literally looks like the devil.
You will be not. There is no drag.
What's the big question people have? Like, what's the thing everybody's wondering about? What's the thing I don't understand? What would I want to hear?
The galaxy isn't growing to push people out. It's growing to let more people come in and find their love so that it's able to continue and create this connective tissue.
It's good to know that people still love it out there and that the people who made it are all proud and passionate about it and willing to come back.
It was a mess, dude. I had to wear a patch for a bit. We went to see Star Wars that night because I said, no, I'm going. We have to go. And I went to see Star Wars with a huge thing on my eye.
I like to denote people as daddies from time to time.
Okay.
And I believe that you are a certified daddy. Like Pedro Pascal's a daddy. Like,
right.
Certified daddy.
I have had the best time ever on Around the Galaxy. Thank you so much.
Well, welcome to Around the Galaxy, the Star Wars fan talk show. I am your host, Pete Fletcher, but I'm also joined, this is our first dual hosting official Around the Galaxy with Nick Milky. Nick, how are you doing?
Outstanding. This is so exciting, and just thinking about how we get to have these opportunities to talk to these amazing guests together. We've both done it individually on our own shows, but then to have the chance to have these conversations, kind of as a group and bounce off of each other, I'm really excited about it.
It's fantastic, and it's a great guest to kick things off. We are joined tonight by David O'Reilly. David joins us. He's a writer, director, and he's a location scout for just about every movie you've ever seen. I think he's done. I found him when Andor was out. He had made a reference to Rogue One. Then I started doing the research. He's worked on The Batman, Rise of Skywalker, Solo, Fast and Furious, Dark Knight Rises. He's worked with everybody doing everything. So I'm excited that we can bring him in and have a conversation, understand what that's all about, get his Star Wars story, and just have some fun. So I am excited to welcome in Mr. David O'Reilly.
Hello.
David, how are you?
I'm good. Yeah. How are you guys?
Can't complain. Can't complain at all. Well, David, the show starts and ends with Star Wars. So let's first of all get to know you a little bit. Tell people who you are and what you do, and then let's talk about your Star Wars connection a bit.
Well, my name's David. I live in London, from London, but Irish parents, so hence the surname. And I left university. I did English at university, and then I started work in like a film commission in London, and gradually then moved into location scouting. And to show you how old I am, my first job was the original Tomb Raider. That's you could date that on IMDb, and like if you cut me in half like a tree, you can see with IMDb.
Count the IMDb rings.
Exactly. So I sort of started from there, early days, sort of sticking pictures down in offices in Pinewood Studios, and then I suppose at those points in your career, you kind of decide. Or you're just looking and seeing how films are made and deciding what to do, and I kind of sort of began to drift towards locations, but then drifted more specifically into location scouting, which is obviously as you would probably imagine, the best bit of the job. The location scouting is the 50%. Or it depends what kind of film it is, but if we call it 50%, it's the exploring and having great fun, meeting people, and then the other 50% is finding out where 250 people are going to go to the toilet and contracts and the glamorous stuff that we all forget about when we watch Star Wars or any kind of movie, but the kind of actual mechanics of filmmaking. So I'm lucky enough I get to play in the very early stages of films, and specifically Star Wars is always really early. But yeah, my first experience, I mean, I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I always go back to Return of the Jedi was the first film I felt like I saw at the cinema. I feel like I'm probably old enough to have seen Empire Strikes Back, but I think it was Return of the Jedi was where I remember engaging with the film, and then obviously as a kid engaging with the toys, and I've got a picture of me somewhere dressed as Han Solo when I was about 6 or 7, holding a Millennium Falcon, which my mum sold, I believe, at a boot sale. So
painful.
Tragic. But so I was always a Star Wars fan, and then found myself in the film industry. And funny enough, I suppose when I first started work, Star Wars was coming back, but obviously it was too early for me to get onto the prequels. Mm-hmm. But I remember those happening, and remember hearing about them happening in London and Italy and stuff like that. And then there was obviously a massive gap, and then they came back again, and I was very lucky to start on Rogue One, really. So there's a lot in between, obviously. There's lots of movies, but and then I was very lucky to kind of have a run on Star Wars where I went from Rogue One to Solo, and then a few other things in between which didn't happen, which we might talk about later, and then on to Rise of Skywalker. So I had a really good kind of 6-year run almost on Star Wars, if you can believe that.
Now, did seeing Star Wars and being a Star Wars fan as a kid, it's always interesting when we have guests because we now live in this world where Star Wars, for a major portion of the population, the world didn't exist without Star Wars, or at least from a very young age, right? I was 7 when I saw it. So for all intents and purposes, it's always been there. So did that drive you into wanting to get into film, or was there something else that drove you into film?
I suppose collectively movies drive you, or they spark the curiosity of how did that work? And I suppose when you watch, any of those great science fiction films or, fantasy, you kind of, it depends what your mind's like. Some people watch them and they kind of wash over them. And I suppose people who get into the film industry see those movies and they're young, and something triggers inside about how did they do that, or where did they do that? And I suppose actually quite young, I had interest in location, where stuff had been filmed.
Yeah,
I suppose is what I would call it before I called it locations. And Star Wars is a great example of that, because even 40 years on plus, it's an industry, going to Star Wars locations. They've got a kind of magic to them that's lasted a long time. So I think collectively movies were my interest, but Star Wars definitely for that age group of that time was the defining franchise. I suppose one of the first franchises, but it was that sparked a lot of filmmakers, I suspect, and I'm sure lots of people that have been on your show have said that is the reason they're in the film industry to some extent. So
sure.
I think it's definitely part of the birthing process of my journey is, inquiring mind, I suppose, of watching films and wondering how and where and why, and then finding out the brutal truth of how the where and the why are's, which I'm sure everyone knows it's a glamorous industry, but actually making movies is particularly hard and brutal to make. And Star Wars is so big that it's a different kind of brutality.
No doubt. And I want to stay on this track for a little bit, and would love for you to kind of dig in a little bit more. You mentioned, it's one thing to find something that looks cool, but then the nuts and bolts of where these people who have to set up shop and work going to be, where the extra is going to be held. Tell us a little bit more about kind of the nuts and bolts of being a location scout, kind of the process, the things you look for, and then we'll come back to the Star Wars of that, because that's its own unique character too.
I mean, it's different every job really, and different directors, different production designers start differently. Essentially, though, you're lucky enough to come on really early, so you get, certainly in Star Wars example, you get to see really early versions of the script, and sometimes there isn't even a script. There's basic beats, or there's kind of worlds that they're interested in. I'll take a non-Star Wars example, and you kind of, you'll meet the production designer initially, and you'll read the script, I suppose, if there's lucky enough to be one. Break it down from your point of view, then you'll meet the production designer. You may meet the director, depending again on the kind of the politics of the show and the dynamic of the show. So I've been lucky to work with Michael Mann 3 times now, and that you really go to him rather than the production designer, because he's got a very clear idea of what he wants. So that's kind of unusual, but it's usually the production designer, and you sit down and you start to dig up old photos you might have, or reference photos, see what they've got on the wall, and then your wall starts to grow in your office, and it's a sort of organic process of on a bigger film, figuring out what the atmosphere of the locations are going to be. Then it kind of becomes more not mechanical, but more methodical, in the sense then Fast and Furious, for example, or less so Batman, but where there's a lot of locations, then there's less time to explore and be fanciful. If there's a street that Vin Diesel needs to drive down at 100 miles an hour, then we've got that we can find the best one, but we have to find the one that actually works, I suppose. So there's always behind the dream there's a reality, which we call it, and funny enough, we call it a lot when we work on Star Wars, is how National Geographic can you go? Now, Star Wars is a good and bad example, is that and I'll tell you about some of the things we did, is because they've got time, and obviously they have money, but I think it's more time. And you'll get a producer that wants to be brave and explore. You can go that extra step and go somewhere crazy. A lower budget project has to, the compromise and the skill is then finding those locations in 5 minutes of the studio. But Star Wars, as an example, typically has to push the boat out, I think, on locations, because you're kind of expecting it. If you think of Bond films, the older Bond films, that half the excitement, even in the 70s and 80s, I reckon, and I suppose 60s, 70s, and 80s, was that they did go to exotic locales, and I think that's kind of their problem now, is that social mobility, everyone can go anywhere and see anything. So it's harder for Bond film, for example, but slightly harder for Star Wars projects to feel like we're shooting, we know we're all filming on Earth, but for it to look fantastic. And
and that was going to be one of my follow-up questions to this, is if you're talking about a Bond or a Fast and the Furious, of course we're looking at exotic locales. They may be in Russia, they may be in San Francisco, but Star Wars is a different ballgame, because we're talking about other galaxies and planets, and so you have to look for a quality that, of course, is achievable on a production side, that you can work in that, but for the viewer who's being immersed in this other galaxy, another world, feels like another world. And I can't imagine there's not challenges in that. Tell us a little bit about that, and maybe even paint that against what we're seeing now with the use of the volume, and how that changes some of, certainly your job, I would imagine, even if you have to go shoot those locations in order for them to be used in the volume. What does it take to find something that looks like another planet, because we're only on Earth?
Well, so Rogue One, I suppose, is my first experience of working on them. That was a very slow start. I kind of came on very early. They were filming, whilst I was working, they were filming Last Jedi. In fact, my first office in Pinewood was in the creature effects department, which was great fun. And they had a cubby hole office for me. And then they said, "Oh, we've been using it for costume changes." And of course, the person who'd been dressing in there was Chewbacca, and no lie, I wish I had kept them. But my chair that the first chair I had in Pinewood Studios on Star Wars was covered in Wookiee hair, and I stupidly didn't keep it. But so you
didn't take any. Oh,
that was my instinct. I didn't know. I totally forgot, and then of course it all got cleaned up, and I was like, this seems odd. There's a musty smell in here. There's been a Wookiee in this room. And then we just started. Me and the production designer Neil Lamont, who was it was really early stage. I mean, like virtually. It's hard to believe even on a big project like that, 2 or 3 people really working on it. Production designer, me kind of feeding the production designer, him coming back to me, and then concept artists starting. And it's so there was a script then, and strangely, there's some really big changes from what it ended up being. And I have it somewhere, but yeah, the ending was completely different. And you start to just break it down in the sense there are we kind of expect desert in Star Wars, so that was always being discussed. But then it's already, even on Rogue One, it was being discussed, how do we make that fresh? And the big part of Rogue One, which never ended up in the film, was Saw Gerrera's environment was the jungle. So, and it was going to be very much like an Apocalypse Now journey up a river to see. It was a much bigger part of the film. And I got sent off to Mexico for a month, and then I went to Thailand, and Vietnam was very close to being in the film, and we found fantastic jungles. And I did temples in Mexico and waterfalls, and had a fantastic time. And then we settled on Thailand, and what Thailand brought us then was this jungle village that we were going to build for Saw Gerrera. And then nearby we found a stretch of beach that would have become Scarif. So even on a Star Wars, there's always these kind of not financial, but I suppose they are financial compromises. It's like, by the way, we've got a Scarif not far, and it wasn't a bad Scarif. I've been back there since. I mean, it probably would have done, was it spectacular as Maldives? No, but and then very unbeknownst to us, we were beginning to get really serious about Thailand, and there was a good number of us out there beginning to organize things and set up meetings. Then all of a sudden, because of the way the planets go, and what we often do in the office, and I'm sure production designers do it, is block out colors. So it's a bit like the wall behind you. We put up, Scarif, and then the different Jeddah, and we put the different colors up and start to see that you can't really go from one desert to another, and so you've got to have these. So it gets really basic, and I've got a document which is literally orange, red, green, yellow. Like showing you can't really butt up against other colors is really basic, and that was obviously going on, and then all of a sudden jungle didn't work. It was too close to what we'd seen, what we would see in the places that we chose in Iceland for the opening. So everything had a knock-on effect. So there's story involved, but there's also like a really basic color palette that you have to follow. Otherwise, I suppose the audience kind of gets lost and thinks, actually they didn't go anywhere.
That's a very traditional Star Wars thing. If you go all the way back to the beginning, we have a desert, and we have the space, and we have the jungle of Yavin. Then you go to Empire, and you've got Hoth and the Snow Planet. You've got Cloud City. You've got a jungle. A jungle in Return of the Jedi, and that has seen its way through all the different Star Wars environments. So we know that's a value that George has, and it certainly creates a visual element of being to recognize you're in a different place.
And it's generally simpler in the originals, isn't it? In terms of there's not as many environments. I know now from my experience and obviously watching the TV shows, we're going to a lot more places, which is quite interesting. Yeah. Which I'm not entirely a big fan of, because I think you spend longer in a place, you start to soak up a bit more of the character of the place, i.e. the characters that you meet. And I think there's a slight tendency now to hop a little bit quicker. Which means more work for me, so I'm not going to disparage the choices. But yeah, so Rogue One kind of it's a really organic and slow, and then all of a sudden really fast kind of method of searching, and we thought we had the jungle, and then that slipped away, and then when we lost the jungle, we couldn't shoot Scarif in Thailand, and we'd always used the Maldives and that kind of environment as a template for our discussions. We would talk about Scarif as if it was the Maldives, without us ever believing that we would go there or we could go there.
Right.
And then when Thailand slipped away, I went to the Maldives and scouted it, and then we sort of, and we knew it was going to be difficult. We were going to keep it kind of small and nimble, because most of Scarif was really built on an airfield in North London. So that, and we'd already started shooting. So we thought, I went to the Maldives. We found some places, and we dug a little deeper, and we chose an atoll. And I did most of that from Google Earth, and I just chose shapes, and then I went to those islands. It's hard to believe now, a few years on, that that's how we made Rogue One. But I was literally, there's 1,200 islands, and I went through every single island looking for, well, if this shape could be good with this shape, and found these 2 uninhabited islands in the least populated atoll in the Maldives. So everything was wrong with it. And then we went there. And then, I suppose it's a lot to do with the producer, I suppose, to kind of said, let's go for it and keep it small. Sure. And the clip I always use when we're talking about filmmaking is in Lethal Weapon 2 or 3, where Danny Glover's sitting on the toilet and the bomb's underneath the toilet. And he says to Martin Riggs, "Martin, just keep it quiet." And then we smash cut to all of the police and all of the guys outside, and that's what filmmaking, certainly on a Star Wars film, is it always starts with, okay, we'll go to the Maldives, we'll keep it nimble, 40, 50 people, couple of extras, and then that's how we're going to do it. And we brought 250 people. We shipped a helicopter in a container from Sri Lanka. We had 50 stormtroopers with the Maldivian army inside them. We had 40 boats, 6 safari boats, because there was not enough accommodation. It was so, and in the morning it was like D-Day, and in the afternoon it was like Dunkirk. It was unbelievable. so it's it's sort of that's a good and a bad example of what you can do when you've got a project that is sort of trying, and I suppose that then Rogue One was an unknown quantity to a certain extent as well. I mean, now we look back on it as kind of like the new dawn of Star Wars film, but then it was sort of unknown, and at the time, obviously, Last Jedi was being shot and hadn't come out yet, so there was this feeling that it was going to be this diffusion brand that was going to be, with a cool director and personal, small scale Star Wars. And then of course Rogue One went on to make $1 billion plus, right. And they were it worked. But genuinely,
it was an okay idea.
It's a big budget, but no one really knew, I suppose.
You were talking before
no one really knew.
Yeah, you were talking a little bit before about how sometimes you end up going down the road and projects don't happen. In connection to that, and I'd love to hear a little bit about some of those adventures. I mean, I think of all the jobs related to film, I mean, never mind the frequent flyer miles, you get to go and see all these phenomenal locations. But do you get direction from like the Star Wars Story Group at all, or is it just because there's so many different stories happening at once now? I wonder if that's an influence at all too.
Yeah, I think it's slightly more complex now, and I without saying what I'm doing or hoping I'm doing later in the year, I did put together a document of, because even back on Rogue One, I put together a document of what planets we had been to,
right,
so far. Just to kind of say, well, obviously that was filmed, and Star Wars had filmed in Thailand before, and so I had quite a simple document at that point, and now it's a much more complex document. In fact, I saw someone online had done it, all the planets that they visited, and now it's a really between cartoon, animation and TV series, and there's a lot. So that's slightly more complex now. I imagine now there has to be a little bit more joined up thinking, I think, because Rogue One, and Solo as well, we were kind of, we didn't really consult. I think maybe the production designers sit down with the story group and Pablo and people like that. But I think generally there was a period there where we were kind of knew enough that I've been on a call today a country in the Middle East that wants to get into filming, and their competition is really Jordan, and Jordan now for Star Wars is kind of played out visually. We can't, we went there for Rogue One for a small bit, and then obviously
you may be having a little bit of an audio issue. Did you guys hear that as well? Okay, now how's that?
Yes.
Let's hear you. Are you still there, David?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
You sound a little robotic.
Let me see.
Oh, there you go. Whatever you just did there, that works.
The adjustment of the screen.
There you go. It's the magic of audio and video working
there you
together.
Go, that's it,
See,
yeah.
it's so important that it looks good so it can sound good.
Exactly. We'll do the audio later in post.
We'll do it.
That's right. Fix it in post.
But so it's a much more complex. I imagine more complex scenario now because we visited a lot of places, but we haven't. I don't feel like we've settled in many places in some of the TV shows. We kind of and so as you said, then the volume. We did some volume stuff, and obviously Rogue One was the cinematographer was Greg Fraser, who then obviously had utilized it in Rogue One, but mainly for on ship work, really.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously he went off to Mandalorian and made it, the new thing. But even strangely now, I think it's beginning to wane slightly already. So COVID scared the location community, if there is one, scared them and thought, oh my God, we're finished. And as you said, what was our job to be filling in what was going to be on the LED. And strangely, sure. I haven't done that. And then I did for Batman with Greg after that. And we didn't use the volume very much. I mean, it's in there for some sunset stuff in buildings and stuff like that. So I don't think it's gone away, but in a very short period of time, it's not fashionable. But now it's almost the remit now to say no, I'm not going to use the volume as much as possible because it's. But and Greg on various interviews and podcasts more recently has said it is quite limiting. So. Yeah. It had its perfect introduction with Mandalorian, I thought, but even looking at the trailer for Mandalorian 3, I suspect they're going on location a bit more.
It definitely looks broader, and it's interesting because it's sort of that evolution of technology. When it first hits, everybody wants to do it, and then, and it's funny because I even think one of the discussions we've had, like a show like Kenobi, which was shot during COVID, which had come off the wild success and the sort of exhilaration of using this new technology, they may have used it too much, right? Because you could suddenly start to see it. Whereas Andor, as a series, it's clear to me that there is limited, if any, use there. So that's really
and I think then the opposite has happened is that people are like, wasn't it fantastic? Andor was in some real places and real sets and real texture. You could tell there was a big difference. And the if you're super organized, the volume is a great tool because it's all pre-production work. But films generally are messy, and you have. Do you know what I mean? So you've got to do all your work up front, whereas the benefit of post-production is you get rid of all your expensive crew. Right. And then you whittle it down to the effects houses to work on. So you've got to be ready to work on those things. But they are limiting in terms of story, I think, as well. And the physicality of what you can do. I'm sure they'll improve, but they're very expensive. And I'm sure I read yesterday somewhere someone's begun to dismantle one somewhere. It might have been in the UK.
Oh wow!
So. But it probably had a great introduction with The Mandalorian, and then COVID kind of made everyone think, well, this is it, we're just going to shoot everything on them. And then I think it only takes a couple of directors in Star Wars or just generally to say it doesn't work for me. Right. I mean, some green screen doesn't work for some directors, and then they have to they push back on that. And I think, but it's a very expensive process that you have to be upfront ready. So
like anything,
Absolutely.
I think it's that evolution of mixing the two. Because with Solo, I think they used it for, you know, in the cockpit and things like that.
Again, it was, and I remember there was the fantastic sets. I mean, they were all fantastic sets on Solo. Of the, I can't remember the name of the barge, but it was the kind of the cocktail party scene, and that was a full LED outside. But that was more traditional, you know, traditional sense. It was a moving painted backdrop, really.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, and so on Solo was similar, really. I went straight from Rogue One and went straight on to Solo with the same production designer, and we did exactly the same. We kind of fleshed ideas out. We put the block of colors, and where, you know, we knew we had to go to, say, Kessel, for instance. So what is Kessel going to be? And it's strange when you're talking about the story group. We would sit around with the production designer and set decorator and people like that, and not necessarily be beholden to anything. You know what I mean? Kessel has featured in books and you know, it has featured before, and people are aware of it. But we didn't feel like we were handcuffed to a look or an idea. And as an example, with Kessel, we had lots of reference, and then we scouted some tin mines in southern Spain, which are spectacular. And they're called the area is called Rio Tinto, but it's, you know, obviously the copper's leaked into the soil and the water, so it's all red and yellow, and it's a unbelievable place. And I think that fed into the look. And then there was a point where I was very very close to going to Ethiopia, to the Danakil depression, which is the hottest place on earth, and it's this kind of yellow bubbling kind of almost, you know, it's not even volcanic, it's just this kind of acidic environment. And we spoke to the Ethiopian, you know, we spoke to the kind of local film commission, and I was going to go, and I'd have to have armed guards to bring me there and all of this kind of thing, and it was quite inaccessible, and obviously the hottest place on earth, and so that went away. And of course what Neil did was he took that idea of the Danakil depression and the look, and that became, and in fact I remember having a big meeting with everyone where I found some drone footage that flew over the top, and the Danakil depression is quite small, but I cut it so it looked big and you were flying over it. Right. And that became the kind of the influence of that set. So a lot of Star Wars work, sometimes your location scouting doesn't amount to a place that you go to film. It serves as a real world influence, I suppose, of a set or of a planet.
Well, and that was going to be one of my follow-up questions, which is, are there some locations, some places that you have scouted that ultimately didn't make, that you really wish, I wish we had put that one on film? Are there any that stand out? 90%.
Because the nature of it is, you know, for every, you know, even on another film or Batman or something like that, you're showing options. So you unless you get it totally right, you rarely show one. You know, if the guy asks for a coffee shop, you show 10 shops and see where his head's at, and then Star Wars is a bit more, it's loose in the sense that we're just looking for an environment, really, a planet, but because it changes so frequently, because of the scripts and, you know, and the blocking of the colors. I mean, you know, as I say, I went to Mexico and saw some amazing stuff that was actually ending up, it was going to be Yavin as well. That's why I went to Mexico. I went to Mexico to find Scarif, which I found some amazing stuff, coastal stuff and islands. And then I was looking at jungle, obviously, for Saw Gerrera. And then I was meant to find the Yavin temple vibe, which they were just unbelievable in Mexico, as you would expect.
For sure.
So we had a 2 for 3 kind of deal there, and then that sort of faded away for other reasons. And so I still think about that. Vietnam would have been amazing, and I think Gareth was destined to film in Vietnam, because I think his clear influence, and I think it's still there, was Apocalypse Now. He really wanted that vibe and that tale. And then, as I say, at that point, it was very much about a journey to Saw Gerrera. and I think it's sort of changed in the various edits, I think.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so a lot of places I go end up not on screen, and A Rise of Skywalker is a good example in that we wanted a jungle. So I'm back to jungles again. And for the opening, I suppose it is the opening of the film, isn't it? With Ray running through the jungle.
Right.
And I got sent to Laos for like a month, and it was just the most spectacular journey of cliffs and waterfalls and like it was just the most amazing place. That kind of got binned and it's not depressing for me. It's because I've been to Laos
You
for
still
a
get
month.
to go.
But there is a point where you kind of go, oh well, wouldn't it have been amazing? But for whatever reason, and also there's not enough time to mope about it. Lots of bad decisions are made on movies, not just Star Wars.
Absolutely. Well, and you talk about
just kind of move on.
That's right. Well, and you talk about, and you mentioned earlier in the show, you mentioned Michael Mann. We look at all the different directors you've worked with: Gareth Edwards, J.J. Abrams, Michael Mann. You've worked with these amazing visionary people, and you say that a lot of times location scouting, you're working with the production designer. I live in Alabama, and years ago in the 2000s, Tim Burton shot a movie here called Big Fish, and I was an extra in it. Got to be around it, and I drove past the town one day, and Tim Burton and two people were walking through this downtown rural Alabama town, pointing at things, and I was like, they're location scouting, like they're looking at things. And of course, he's a very visual director. All directors are visual, of course, but he has a very specific style, and you kind of mentioned that with Michael Mann. I would love to hear a little bit of your thoughts, and certainly working with these different directors, what's that like from a location scout? Because you are trying to find what matches their vision, but also what matches their style, and it can often be very specific. I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, and like I said, a lot of people are all directors, all production designers are different in terms of the amount of control they want and the clear vision. Like I said, Michael is very, as you would imagine from his movies, very location focused. His films are location films, and his films are almost about the environments that the characters are within. He's quite a sort of outlier in that respect, and I worked with him last year as well, and it's all about the place. Like there's whole essays written about cities and cityscapes and what they mean to the people and the person. So he's kind of an outlier because he has a real clear idea of what he wants and what it means to the character. And I remember I did the first film I did with him was called Black Cat with Chris Hemsworth, which was out in Malaysia and Hong Kong, and I had to find a villain's house. And if you were doing Fast and Furious, it would be, and this is not to disparage the Fast and Furious franchise, but it would be they would go, I don't know, somewhere cool for the villain, like that would be it. It would be like, oh yeah, something like like a Bond villains, like that. And I went to see it, and we were looking for lots of other stuff, but I always remember the story with Michael. We sat in this hotel in Malaysia, and with the art director Damien, and we sat there, and I said, what do you really want? And 20-30 minutes later, he'd finished describing this guy's house. What was on the wall, what he, like he had so much backstory and detail about the character that it was just like overwhelming. That
we have to go build this place.
Yeah, exactly. It was terrifying. You couldn't find it, and luckily, strangely, I did find it, and it's inconsequential in the movie, strangely, and I think that's what's great about Michael is he's so detailed, but it doesn't overwhelm the character and the story, but it feeds into your experience. Where that person stands in the frame in that house, or Robert De Niro in that window of that place in Malibu. Like they're kind of he's almost absent-mindedly making iconic images and feelings that they just pass by. And that was we couldn't have been clearer about who that villain was and where he was and why he lived in this particular house. And then I found this kind of wooden styled kind of it was quite specific. And as soon as he saw it, he was like, that's it, and that's where we shot. And it's in the film for like seconds. Tim Burton's the same, really. One of my earlier films, I did Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which was great fun. Now most of that was studio, but there was there was a fair amount of locations to find, and it was sort of early in my career. And then the last thing I did a couple of things in between. That one of them didn't happen, and I did a great job, which was research on Sweeney Todd, which was 100%. 100% stage, but I went and scouted locations that they used for reference, I suppose, for buildings and stuff like that. So that was a lovely job. But then the last one I did just before, funny enough, literally just before Rogue One, was Miss Peregrine's School for Peculiar Children. And of course, the big search there was the house, or was the school. And I was on that for a long time with trying to figure it out. And we had no production designer, so it was really just me and the location manager trying to figure it out, and going to see Tim and going, is this it? And so it was obviously an English house, but it wasn't working. And we did hundreds and hundreds of houses. As you can imagine, England can the UK can soak up country houses pretty quickly. So we had literally hundreds and hundreds, and it wasn't working. And then I stumbled across a picture that I can't remember his name, unfortunately, but the guy who wrote the book used a kind of reference online of a building that he had seen online in Belgium. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And it was falling apart, so it was no good. And then I said to the producers, can I go to Belgium for a few weeks and see what's going on, So I went to Antwerp and hooked up with a person I knew from Antwerp, Annabelle, who showed me around, and we started stumbling across unbelievable amounts of these spectacular houses. And then I found a particular one, and it was called Torrenhof. And I remember pulling up around the corner, and this rarely happens, but I suppose it's what you want to hear location scouts do, is that we pulled up and I went, oh my God, this is it. This is it.
Yep.
But the reality is that I thought deep down this was it. That was the house. And then of course you just have to carry on working. So I didn't ring him and go, I think we found it, because that's the way of death. But so we carried on, and we found more stuff, and we had quite a good selection of Antwerpian, if that's a word, houses. And then we went back, we boarded all the pictures, we put them all together, and then I bravely we went to his house. I bravely put that on top, and I said, and I think I said. And maybe I was being cheeky. I said, I think this is quite Burton-esque, because he is his own adjective. And he said, he kind of looked at me and he said something like, I think you knew this, didn't you? And I thought, I did, but you know what? I wasn't brave enough to stop the search. And that's where they went and shot. And I don't think the producers were particularly happy, because this was a UK-based show. And the next thing you know, they had to go and decamp to Antwerp but it ended up on the poster. It ended up on the poster, so it was for all the film. I mean, it's a good film, but that house really says Tim Burton. Now, just as a very quick aside about how difficult filming is, that house was perfect. It was owned by this kind of group of brothers and sisters, elderly. And we went and said, oh, we'd love to do a film here in 2 or 3 months' time. And then they said, oh, we're selling it. And then everyone's life starts to fall apart, because we found the perfect place. And then at one point, the producers went to an auction in Antwerp to potentially buy that house, because that was the house we wanted. And in fact, what they did is they stood back, watched who bought it, and then went up to that person who just bought this lovely house, but obviously it was in serious need of work. And I think he bought it for his, to live there and not to just do it up and sell it. And the producers went straight up to him and said, congratulations, you bought this house. Would you like us to film there for 6 weeks, 2 months or something? Luckily for me, they said yes. But so that just shows you nothing's ever easy. I found the perfect house, and then they were selling.
And now it's going away.
I imagine that there's probably you think, well, of course they're going to want their house in a movie, and it's not. Yeah. I wouldn't put it that way. Right. You don't want that traipsing around through.
We were lucky they had a kind of deteriorating house that hopefully, and I've never been back there. Hopefully, we paid for a lot of their renovation work, and I'm sure it's. I mean, it was a spectacular place. I'm sure it's even more so now.
You used a word,
but so that's an example of Burton-esque.
Oh, so yeah, no, you use the word Burton-esque, and it's interesting because the other esque that you hear a lot of is Kubrick-esque, right? And you did a film called Kubrick by Candlelight. You wrote and directed it. Tell us a little bit about the movie, and where did the inspiration come to create that short film?
Well, it was during Solo, funny enough. So it's quite a while ago, and I think we were in the good thing about the Star Wars films is they were extremely long prep times.
Mm-hmm.
So usually a prep time feature would be, I mean, if I'm on it, it's like 6 months before you film,
right.
But 12, 13 months preps, which is crazy.
We're losing your audio again. Maybe just sorry about that.
Is that good?
Not quite.
But yeah, I can see the green is back. Is that better?
No, I'm hearing it's a little bit fuzzy. That was interesting.
So I'm not sure whether it's.
I'm
not sure. I mean, this is a brand new laptop. I'm being disappointed.
Yeah, sort of like the TV antenna, but it's still not quite good. Let's see.
Testing.
I wonder. No. I wonder if he refreshes the window.
Yeah. Do you want to maybe pop off and try to come back, see if that works?
I'll come straight back on.
Yeah. Give that a go.
See what happens here.
Yeah.
Is that any better?
That is better.
It's weird, isn't it?
Yeah. We'll blame it on British internet. That's what.
Absolutely. Please do. Yeah. Please do.
So yeah, I had just asked you about your Kubrick by Candlelight and where the inspiration came to create that.
Yeah. So we were in the middle of Solo, and I think there was it's obvious, and I haven't sent it to you. I will send it to you, but it's about behind the scenes, obviously. So you would expect I know what goes on behind the scenes, but it was. I suppose I'm a big Kubrick fan as well as a big Star Wars fan, but I was always interested in the stories I'd heard about Barry Lyndon because it shot in Ireland, which was my interest, but also the stories I'd heard why they left very abruptly because they received this mysterious call from the IRA, and there was a kind of mythology about the actual physical filming of that movie, and that story had always stuck in my head as a person that's involved in pre-production and movies and locations. And then the theme of it in some ways is, and it's definitely not a documentary, it's a very loose comedy, is kind of what I was saying earlier, is Barry Lyndon's regarded as one of the most sort of beautiful looking films of all time. But I know, having read about it, but I also know because of my own experience of filmmaking, is everything behind that camera is mud and bacon sandwiches and grips with their butt cracks hanging out and toilets falling over, and like it's just pure mayhem and dirt and brutality, and then you get to that point of the camera, and then you're looking at a kind of 18th century picture, and so those two kind of ideas came to me, and I like comedy films, so it was a comedy. But so those kind of the strands came together as an idea, and I took a couple of weeks out of Solo in early pre-production, and then we went and shot it, and it was exactly that. It was almost like a microcosm of the film. We were kind of a half a UK crew filming in Ireland, about a UK filming in Ireland, and the weather was killing us, and there were blocked toilets, and there were grips with their butts going. Like it was, we were the film within the film within the film. But yeah, so it came from, I suppose, my expertise, which would be, I've been behind the scenes. I kind of know what goes on back there, and I know people sometimes. Yeah, I think people know it's kind of tough behind the scenes, but the idea that you can do that and create such beautiful art, I suppose, was the theme. And then it was just fill it with lots of Kubrick references. There's about 90. Although someone recently went and saw the film and went through it all and found way more than 90, which is strange because I didn't put any more than I thought I'd put in. And then it's sort of we slow edit and all of the post production, and we were very lucky then to get Brian Cox from Succession to be the narrator, and then it came out and did quite well, and I think we're going to put it online soon just to kind of
excellent
release it finally. But it's been on Irish TV and airlines, and so we've kind of had a long life with it, but actually now I just want it to be out for as many people as possible.
That's right, get it out there. Well, I'm excited because we want to check it out.
I'll send you a link.
That'd be great.
Pre-link, but it's definitely not a documentary, but it's definitely from a place of love for Stanley Kubrick and filmmaking. And strangely, if you can spot it, a love of Mel Brooks as well. So
awesome.
Probably not what you're expecting to see. Someone emailed me a few weeks ago and they're like, "Oh, I really want to see your docu." Oh no, maybe it was you. Was it one of you guys? Did you say docu? I think someone said it's a documentary, and I was like, "Yeah, I hope you don't think it's a documentary." You'll see what I mean when you see it. It's definitely not. It's fast and loose with. It's a love story behind the scenes, but which mirrors kind of the plot of Barry Lyndon. So it was a lot of fun to make, and in some ways it was me and the producer, who's a location manager as well. And it's not to do with working on Star Wars films. There was a point where we were like, films are quite badly organized, and we lose a lot of money doing stupid stuff. And our answer to ourselves was, all right, put up or shut up. Let's make a film that looks like a big movie. That was our kind of remit, and see if it is as wasteful and as crazy as we experience on a day-to-day basis. It was completely. I'm still paying for the film now.
Lived up to the expectations,
and it nearly killed us. And but there you go. But it was it was good fun. And obviously, I suppose the question to myself, but obviously I get asked when I show it, is what am I going to do next? So that's really what I've got to do next. It's something else. But we put a lot of effort and money into it, and it kind of physically and financially wiped us out. Which is what filming.
Speaking of, that's right. Well, speaking of fun and good questions that we ask ourselves, or sometimes we ask you, we're going to transition now into our 10 questions segment. And as we say in the show, we start with Star Wars, we end with Star Wars. So we have a 10-question quiz. We kind of say, it's kind of like inside the actor's studio, but all Star Wars and fun stuff. And the main thing we say is there's no wrong answers. We will not judge you, but the internet might, and we just don't have any control over that.
The internet's not very judgmental, so it's,
it never is.
It'll be fine.
With that disclaimer aside, I'll ask you our first question, which is, what is your favorite Star Wars movie, TV show, or book? You can pick one. You can pick one of each. It's totally up to you.
Well, I think personally, it remains Return of the Jedi, because I think that's when I kind of switched it into, I suppose, obviously different levels of obsession. I haven't got as obsessive background as you guys do, perhaps, but there's a bit of Star Wars in there.
Yeah, I see it.
Got Lobot. That's right.
I'm still desperate for a Lobot film because I feel like I'm going to audition for it. But
that's your follow-up project.
I would say Return of the Jedi because I still love watching it, and I still feel like that's my film. Do you know what I mean? Like I suppose that's
absolutely.
Bond film. it's people's Bond films when my Bond is Roger Moore, and it always will be, because that's when I started watching them. And so I think that's the personal. I would say Rogue One as a kind of subdivision, because then that begun my own physical journey and spiritual journey in the Star Wars world, which sort of still carries on today, because I'm talking to you guys. So, those are the two, for different reasons, my kind of my standpoints, I suppose.
That's great. This next question, I love asking people who are in the film industry, and that is, what is your favorite non-Star Wars film?
Well, I referenced it slightly earlier. I mean, it depends on your mood. I suppose it's a mood-based question.
It probably is, right?
If I'm feeling dark and deep, I would say Apocalypse Now. And again, that's kind of an obvious one for filmmakers, certainly, and lots of filmmakers still use it as reference. If I'm in a really good mood, it's Blazing Saddles. So,
such a great movie.
Now, if you said to me right now, what would I watch? I'd watch Blazing Saddles. So there you go. You have to be in the mood for Apocalypse Now, don't you? Really?
It's kind of a good thermometer to see where your mood is.
Right.
Exactly. But Blazing Saddles, I feel like I've seen that, once a week for most of my life. But
outstanding. Well, the next question is, describe Star Wars in 3 words or less.
Oh my God. That's actually, I think I'll go epic, personal. See, that should be good. Just those two, shouldn't it? Epic, personal. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. It's like a sort of macro and micro. I think it's obviously spectacularly large, and yet what we take away from it often is just the personal reaction to it, and also the personal stories within the show.
Without a doubt. I love that.
So I'm going to reduce it to 2. Sorry.
There you go. Hey,
for sure.
It's probably gave you or less.
So it works, yeah.
And that is one of the amazing things about Star Wars to me too, is the story has clearly become, if you look at the overarching themes, it's family, so it's super personal, but it's that personal thing that we take from it, whether it's memories, seeing it for the first time, whether it's at times with friends, whatever. So it's absolutely, it's a great way to describe it. All right, as somebody who picks locations, I'm going to ask you a question about sound. What is your favorite Star Wars sound effect?
I would, and I've got 2 kids, so we've got lots of sound effects machines, and I think I've got a couple of Star Wars sound effects machines. And actually, there used to be the Star Wars app used to have a really good sound.
Oh yes,
and I remember, which was quite fun. I don't know if it's still there. I would say it's that noise that R2-D2 makes when he gets a shock. That one? It's like a sort of the scream. I like that sound. There's obviously plenty of other sound effects, but I feel like that's the one I can hear in my head right now. Is that recoiling scream?
Yep. Yeah, you feel it a little too personally when that happens. Like, ooh,
exactly, exactly, and that's kind of the beauty of it. It's like there is a robot, and however with the guy in it, or however you want to see it, and yet that makes you think, oh wow, he feels, like that's kind of interesting.
Well, and that's a perfect lead into our next question, which is, who or what is your favorite Star Wars droid?
Well. Yeah, it's interesting. I've been trying to write a short film about the mouse droid, funny enough, which is completely by its side. I wanted to do a Star Wars short film just as as an exercise, and I couldn't afford big stuff, and I started looking into mouse droids, and some people have made some stuff about mouse droids, but I was going to do like a kind of a Wall-E style short film with a mouse droid.
Nice. Oh, wow.
I may still do it. So for now, I shall say, I know there's obviously much cooler ones, but I will say the mouse droid, because I'm thinking about them at the moment.
And that's a great answer, because that's another one of those iconic Star Wars things that we all, seeing it growing up, rolling through the Death Star when Chewbacca yells at it and it turns around and runs the other way.
Exactly. That's kind of, that's the thing that was in my head when I was thinking about this film. It's like, it's almost the beauty of Star Wars really is those, there's so much detail that's not thrown away, but it's on the periphery, and you know, and because it's been around so long and fans are kind of crazy for it. Mouse Droid probably has. I mean, I know it does it. It's got tons of YouTube channels and you know, like Twitter accounts, and there's like people
There's a following for everything.
Take what they want and then go with it, which is fantastic.
And the Mouse Droid to me is another one of those thousands of examples of things that just shouldn't work, right? I mean, we're going to put this little, essentially a remote control car with a black cover on it, and it's got a cult following. So
I know, and that's what I mean. It's like, imagine in '76 them kind of thinking, well, we need something that's kind of just, you know, going around the Death Star, and someone sat there, came up with it, and then they went, yeah, it's great, let's go for it. I mean, it's just fantastic.
The same thing with the Gonk Droid. It's just a gas pump with legs making a noise.
And now there's a whole industry of these guys.
Yep,
Remarkable.
Exactly.
Well, speaking of characters, which Star Wars character would you most like to be, and why?
Well, I imagine most people say Han Solo.
A lot of people say Han Solo. Yes.
Yeah, I suppose I would. I think if I bring it back to where I started my story, obviously when I was young, I wanted to be Han Solo. I've got the picture of me wearing the waistcoat, and he, you know, I suppose he was. I suppose I want to be Harrison Ford. Maybe that's what I'm saying.
That's right. That's a good answer.
But yeah, so I know that's probably an obvious one. But I suppose really what I should say is I've always wanted to be Lobot, but that's something that nature has done to me. It wasn't a choice. So, I'm still hanging out for Lobot.
What is? I'm looking at my list. This is a fun one, and of course, as we say, social media can be its own thing. We don't really think that's the real world, but everybody has an opinion. So we're going to ask, what is your Star Wars unpopular opinion, if you have one?
Oh my god! Well, you know, it is quite tricky, isn't it? Because I work in it. I hope to work in it again. So,
and we by no means want to get you in trouble.
You got to be, but so yeah, it's weird, isn't it? And I felt like the TV shows, it's been a roller coaster, isn't it? In some ways, the Mandalorian was great, but it felt limited because of, I suppose, some of those technical challenges. But now I'm super excited for season 3, and then I'm part of this meme that's going around on Twitter at the moment because, tragically, I didn't watch the Book of Boba Fett. So when I saw that Mandalorian was coming back, I was like, what happened there? And then I realize I've meant to have watched the Book of Boba Fett in between to find out what's going to say. So it is a roller coaster ride. And so here's an unpopular opinion, I suppose. And I can say it because I chose, I've changed my point of view, is that I didn't really like Andor when it started.
Okay.
And I thought, you know, I suppose I'm part of Andor in a strange way. Is like,
sure,
I'm part of the inspiration to a certain extent. But initially, I was like, I don't. Yeah, I wasn't feeling it, and funny enough, I reacted. I didn't really like where they were filming, and it was like more on a professional level. I was just like, I don't know, this feels too UK based. You know, like there was a real feeling, and then they got to the dam, and you know, like but maybe that's not as unpopular because I feel a lot of people were like, this is so boring, and that was kind of the narrative a bit. But then it really kicked in, didn't it? And now I think I'm going to start watching it again and reappraise it completely. But definitely at the beginning I was like, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure if it's working for me, or it's a bit slow, or it was a bit drab looking. But then I started to live with it, and I realized that those were really deliberate choices that they were making to tell that story. And now, you know, on reflection of seeing, I suppose, the second half of that season, it was like I was doing what people haven't done for a long time, which is I'm waiting for it to come on to Disney Plus. Like I was refreshing, waiting for it to come on in the UK. So is that an unpopular opinion? That's kind of.
I think it totally works. Totally works.
It's interesting. It's been such an interesting, and it's one of the rare, I'll call it fun debates, because it's one of the few times where people didn't dislike Star Wars because of some stupid kind of political motivation. The people who didn't like it at first, it was simply because of pace of story or the fact that it wasn't as high adventure, and that is totally cool because that's an opinion about Star Wars. Nobody was like, I didn't like Andor because whatever. I think it's a great opinion, and it's interesting too because it's a real interesting debate about what is Star Wars. So, for example, last night my son, he's 10 years old, he's like, let's watch a show again. Let's start to watch another show. I was like, do you want to watch Andor? You didn't watch that. He's like, no, I don't want to watch Andor. So he never got caught up. But I mean, he's 10, and so we started watching Mandalorian again, which I'm pretty excited about. So yeah, go ahead.
Which is what's exciting about the TV shows, really. I think that there's going to be enough of a volume, no pun intended, that they can work with different audiences. The audience of Mandalorian doesn't have to be the audience of Andor. It's the same product, the same brand, but it's different storytelling in that same world. And I think that's what I remember about Rogue One. And as I was saying about those early days, it felt the idea was that it was going to be a diffusion brand that I think it even had a name, and I can't remember. It was like they were going to call it Star Wars Black or something like. I'm sure even then there was this idea that it was going to be, the Black series of the tour. Like it was this. Sure. And I think that fell apart a bit. And Solo then it didn't do so well, and I think they lost their bottle a bit with the side stories, and it's strange because now we look back on Rogue One as the perfect side story. Yeah, and in fact, wouldn't it be great if we'd carried on in that vein? But what happened is that Force Awakens made a ton of money, and they were like, so it was complicated time for them to decide to go down that path. Yeah. But I think they are now with the TV shows. They're kind of giving different age groups, because of course they are dealing with different age groups. Our age group was the original age group, and now they're giving us the kind of stories that we would watch or would want to watch, in that world.
I seem to remember that was kind of the promise of the Disney era of Star Wars, was they were going to make a comedy and they were going to make a war heist movie and that sort of thing, which they started to do. And I think that TV definitely gives them some different options. So that's great. Cool. If you could own any spaceship or vehicle from the Star Wars universe, which one would you own? And you know what? I'm going to pull the Falcon out because so many people say it. I'm going to give you a little bit of a challenge on that one.
Well, because I was not part of it, but I was physically there throughout the whole process. And I've sat in it. I loved Solo's car, the blue. I think it did have a name, but the blue car, which we called the book. We called the book or something, like that, because it looked like a book, and it went through. We literally, that's the beauty and the excitement of being on these films, is because of my job is part of the very early process. I get to be part of meetings where they're all talking about the color of that car, and you see models and you see how much it changes. And of course, you can't see them here, but I've got all of the art books, which I'm sure you do. And then you kind of, now we can all see the process where you start and then you get to. And I remember, and then I sat in that car in the top gear, near the Top Gear track, which might mean something to. But
absolutely,
where we filmed a lot of the behind the not the behind the scenes, but the kind of the process stuff of them driving around and tested it. So I felt excited that I was that. So I would choose that because it's pretty cool anyway. But and I think my son's got it in Lego over there. But it was, and I remember physically seeing it being built, and then realize, and being in that group of people that would come and say and look and say, oh, here we go, and it's red, and now it's blue, and now it's got this, and the detail on it was unbelievable. And that thing could drive, like it was it was a serious piece of work. I mean, it was a dangerous vehicle. So I'll go with that. And I'm sure it's got a name, and I feel bad, but I think let's call it Han Solo's speeder. Or Han Solo's car, wasn't it? It was the hot rod or something like that.
The hot rod, there you go. Totally works. Well, the next question, and this one is going to be right up your alley as a location scout. If you could vacation in one Star Wars spot, what would you choose?
Well, I think you'd expect me to, and I think I will say I would go to Scarif.
Yeah, right.
Now, and it, it's a double-edged sword. I spent 10 weeks. So I scouted the Maldives, and then I did the shoot because I thought I should stay on and look after.
Oh, of course, yes, for sure.
and it was spectacular and quite hard work, and it a challenging physical environment, but if of any film, but imagine someone saying, where's this Star Wars environment? It's going to be a tropical beach island place. And where do you think we're going to go? Let's go to the Maldives.
Right.
We still talk about it, me and my colleagues, even now. It's a bizarre and crazy thing to have done. And not many people can say they went and filmed in the Maldives at all, but let alone with a Star Wars film. So I'm going to go Scarif. And why wouldn't you?
Totally works.
I'll go. Let me go pre-mining Scarif, maybe.
There you go. Yeah, that's a totally acceptable and expected answer. And I was going to give you a quick fact check. Han Speeder was the M68, was what it was called. So.
Yes. I remember it when it was the M65.
See, that's right. You had to get to that next version.
That's great. Well, we made it to the last question, and that is, what is your go-to Star Wars quote? Maybe not necessarily your favorite, but the one that comes out of your mouth the most often.
Oh my God. Yeah, see, I suppose the obvious answers are some of Han Solo's, but it's probably something. It's probably something like Darth Vader that I use most. I'm stumped. I'm just trying to think what it. So I'd love to say, oh, it's good shot, son, but it's probably not. I think probably it's with my kids, and I say use the fork. But it's my own version of the Star Wars line, so it works for me. I'm going to go for that. Teaching them how to eat properly.
Excellent.
That's right. It's a good choice.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I've told the story before. I used with mine dropping off at daycare and leaving the older ones in the car for a moment, just while I run in to pick the little one up from daycare. And I would say to him, I'd say, lock the doors and hope they don't have blasters, because that was always that classic, droids in the alley shed. And so we can use it with our kids lots of different ways.
And you can, yeah. We're passing it on through the generations.
We're totally passing it on. It's totally it.
But see, now I'm gonna think about this post podcast and think there will be a say all the time, I'm sure. But
we're gonna get like some random middle of the night DM from David saying, "Hey, I figured it out. Here it is.
This is the one."
What I will dig out and I'll send it to you is talking about the Maldives, because we bought into the whole thing, is the map that we did for when people filmed on these two islands. I did in the style of a treasure map, and we stuck it to trees. It was great, and I have my own road because we made this road through one of the. It's all just like it's all coming back to me now. But I'll send you. I'll send you the map that I made. That was like our location map for a Star Wars film, but it was a treasure map.
Oh, that's fantastic!
Absolutely, that's so cool.
It's barely work, really.
Sounds like you might have one of the most fun jobs in movie making. So, but David, thank you so much for joining us. This was fantastic. I appreciate the time. The stories were great. Where can people follow you on social media?
I'm on Twitter, but not that much. But Franco Films something UK. I can't remember what it is. It's Franco Films. Something UK.
We'll put it in the notes below so people.
Franco Film _ That's why it's tricky. _ UK. But then I have I'm mainly on Instagram, like as you would expect, location photographer, and that's Kubrick Perspectives, where you'll see very specific pictures that I take, which are 1-point perspective pictures. And if you dig around in there, you can see my whole journey. I've pictures in the Maldives, pictures in Mexico, Hong Kong. So strangely, you won't be able to figure out what I'm doing, but post event I will tell people what I was doing in that particular country. But I take one style of picture all over the world. Basically.
So if you're looking for previews of movies that you don't even know about yet, follow
exactly.
Instagram.
See where I've been and where I am, and then try and figure it out. I'm sure someone will now, won't they? and then Kubrick by Candlelight will be online, and I won't be shy about advertising it, so people will know.
And neither will we. We will definitely make sure everybody knows about it.
Thank you very much.
But thank you so much for your time. This was a blast, and we look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Definitely. Thank you very much. Great to speak to you.